It's nearly Christmas. The people of this close-knit logging community watch as the '69 Chrysler of Ed and Minnie Marine drives through the center of town. They don't know that their neighbors will soon be dead.
I didn't get the call until 8:30 at night. I had came home from working out in the wet, cold snow and ice and had dinner and was headed off to bed when my dad called and said, "You need to come down to Grandma and Grandpa's." And I knew something was wrong right then. I got in my truck, left my ranch, went down, and there was many things going through my mind. It was spinning fast, I know. Get around the corner, and I see all the cop vehicles. Felt like my heart dropped out of my chest and hit the bottom. As soon as I got out of my pickup, I was greeted by one of the officers. He said, "We don't know for sure, but your grandma and grandpa is missing, and there looks like there's been some foul play." I walked in, and I see papers strung around in the house. They kept a bunch of bank statements in shoe boxes, and they were strung out over the living room. Grandma's purse was left by her chair, tucked behind the couch. She never left the house without her purse. This ain't normal.
My dad came over to our house, and he said Grandma and Grandpa were missing. Their car was missing, too. We were all in shock and disbelief.
The Morans had some financial means. They sold Christmas trees from their Christmas tree field. One scenario was probably that maybe they'd been kidnapped and were being held somewhere. Dennis Hadler was Minnie Moran's son. He was a well-known entity in Lewis County because he was the owner of Dennis Hadler Logging.
He was probably one of the largest logging companies in the Northwest at the time. I remember growing up here in Lewis County, and if you worked in the woods, you probably worked for Dennis Hadler.
I thought somebody grabbed Ed and my mother, and that they would hold them ransom.
You know, most everybody was trying to think the best, but figuring that the worst was about to come.
The very next day, in the early morning hours, an employee at the Yardbird Shopping Mall reports a vehicle matching the Marin's description. Detectives responded over to the parking lot and they found the car. It is a icy morning. They could not see in the window, and one of the detectives, instead of touching the car without having fingerprints, blew warm air onto the glass. Once he did that, he could see that the car was covered in blood, which would probably be burned in his brain for the rest of his life. There was a red blanket covering the seat. The detectives could see damage from what appeared to be shotgun pellets going into the dash. Mr. Marin's hat that he's known to wear all the time was laying on a floorboard, and still no sign of Ed and Minnie. Maybe they're in the trunk. There's nothing in the trunk.
I never did go see the car.
Did you want to see the car? Did you choose not to see the car?
I chose not to go look at the car.
During the first few days that Grandma and Grandpa were missing, we got together at my mom and dad's house with search and rescue. They had a huge map. We were given a section to go and look for them.
There must have been a couple hundred people involved, plus all the sheriffs, and pretty intense search.
We gotta find them. They're out there, and we know that they're hurt.
We were searching everywhere, but the logging roads are endless around here.
I'm actually scared to get out and look. I was terrified.
I was out scouring the different county roads when I got the call over the radio and said they had found their bodies.
A man was traveling down a logging road, and he saw what he thought was a CPR dummy. And then he realized that it wasn't a CPR dummy. He had actually discovered the body of Minnie Marin.
A friend of mine was the one that found them. He saw Grandma laying alongside the road. And then Grandpa was in the brush, close to her.
Minnie had been shot in the left shoulder and the neck, and then Ed had been shot almost square on in the back.
We go to the scene. We realize that there are drag marks saying they were drugged from their car and dumped like garbage along the side of the road.
When we went up to look at the crime scene, it was ribboned off, and my dad said, well, I guess that's Mom's blood, because it was frozen where she laid. The hard part is they were scared to death in their last few moments together, and then one of them had to see the other one die.
The last time that I seen my grandparents was on the Sunday before they disappeared, and I stopped in to see them. Took my grandfather down to the store, got milk and eggs and bread, not realizing that that's the last time you're going to be able to touch them or hold them or talk to them or see them or anything.
I put my hand on her, on the casket, and I said, Mom, we're gonna catch him.
I grew up in Lewis County. In 1985, when this occurred, I was 10 years old. Ed and Minnie were everybody's grandparents. The murder changed the way a lot of people felt growing up and living here. It bothers you.
When the Morins were killed, the public asked us about it constantly. The question would be who? Who would do this to two 85-year-old, defenseless, old people? We really wanted to succeed. But we had no murder weapon. We had no fingerprints of suspects at the crime scene. We had no DNA evidence because there was none in that day and age.
There's dozens and dozens of fingerprints in the house, in the vehicle, an exterior of the vehicle. The majority of those prints came back to Ed and Minnie and some other family members. One of the biggest items that's collected as evidence is that they found a bank receipt in Ed's pocket.
I'm presently out at Sterling Savings. Apparently you had a transaction with Mr. Morin. Could you explain what occurred now?
Mr. Morin called and asked if we had any money. And I said, yeah, we had a nickel or a dime. And he said, no, he would need a little more than that. And I asked him how much, and he said $8,500.
When he got there, the money still wasn't ready, and so rather than wait in the bank, Ed went back out to the car. And when the teller went out to get him, Ed got out of the car before she got too close. She thought that she saw someone else in the car, but couldn't be sure.
When Ed Morin withdrew $8,500 from the bank, the question became, who knew that they had that money to withdraw? What if it was a family member of the Morins? There were cigarette butts in the car. Ed and Minnie did not smoke, and Mike Adler did smoke.
They're going to bring all the people out, and then the caskets will pile up behind them. So you're going to get some good shots of everybody coming out. Recording? Here comes the casket. A couple of the people we want to talk to. I'll get the pallbearer. Here comes your guy right there. Okay, make Mike press now. That's the bad guy.
Some family members were looked at a little bit harder than others simply because of their history, and one of those was Mike. Mike had had a history with law enforcement.
Mike had a temper, a little bit too much drinking and fighting and getting involved in things that he probably shouldn't have.
They made me mad, pissed me off. And I pretty much told them to kiss my ass.
You want to look at someone who had access to the house since there wasn't forced entry. You want to look at somebody that has knowledge of how much money they had. And so they also looked at Rodney, one of the grandsons.
Whenever you have these type murder deals, it's usually always a family member or something like that, they say, that does it because they're all disgruntled or whatever. So they come in and ask you these questions. I call it interrogation. It made you feel like you're guilty.
Between 84 and 86, there's a lot of major crime that's occurring in our massive acres of forest land. We got rape, murder, we got the Green River Killer discarding multiple bodies on the side of the county roads out in the places where there's no neighbor, you got nothing but trees for approximately 2,500 square miles. I-5 runs right through Lewis County. The interstate brings transients and criminals that normally do not live here, that shouldn't be here, and causing problems and crimes. One of them could be the killer in this investigation.
I saw a man with a rifle at Yardbirds.
One of the bigger tips we had was from two ladies who were cutting through the Yardbirds parking lot.
He was walking fast towards the trees.
Okay. Can you think of anything else?
I thought it was really strange for him to be carrying a gun across the parking lot. And it was weird that it was wrapped in something instead of in a case or just bare.
This was our first description of a suspect leaving the vicinity of the car.
He had dark brown wavy hair with a small growth of beard on his face. He had on a stocking cap and a green army coat.
Once we released the sketch, of course, everybody's calling in. Everybody imagines that the person they see could be the person in the sketch.
I didn't look nothing like the composite. Does my hair look dark?
We took pictures of anybody who met the physical description of the sketch that we had drawn.
I know that workers that had worked on that Christmas tree farm were suspects also. The police took pictures of them too. And then they made a lineup of, I don't know, 8, 10 pictures or however many they had.
The detectives gave that photo montage of black and white and small pictures to all these witnesses, and nobody could identify a suspect.
The cops were running into dead ends every time they turned around.
How may I help you?
The police received a phone call that somebody had important information about the Morin case.
I just found out about a guy that done a double murder. I'm talking about my brother.
Turns out his brother, Scott Coulter, he was married in the family at one time.
In fact, he laughed about it because it was his wife's grandparents. He said, oh yeah, but I got that bitch. I killed her grandparents. And I got all her savings, too.
And we decided that we would focus on Scott Coulter.
He had burglaries in his history. He had violence in his history. And it was thought that he was seen in the area where the car was found.
He was involved in the drug world. We didn't have anything solid on him, so there was no reason to think that if we interviewed him, he would tell us anything.
The detectives devised a plan where they would pretend to be with the mob and that he was going to be initiated into the mob in order to make some money.
We met at the Tacoma Narrows International Airport. We got him in the car, and we told him that he had to tell us about something he had done, which was so serious, he would never dare tell anybody about us. I told him down towards the Chehalis Centralia area, there was a job involving 2 old people, and our sources are telling us that he might be involved in that. But you have to tell us something that tells us you're the man. This could be the guy. Scott Coulter was about to admit that he had specific information about the Morin case. We tried not to act surprised, but we looked at each other and our eyes got wide. We said, okay, tell us about that. And Scott actually said, well, I just got him in the car and took him to the Yardbird Shopping Center, and he went like that. Well, of course, it wasn't a handgun at all. Now, what kind of gun did you use? And he said a 22. It wasn't a 22. It was a 12-gauge shotgun. He had the wrong kind of gun. He was wrong on where they were killed. He didn't have the right answer to anything. You could have read the paper and gotten more right. He wanted to be the guy so badly that he would lie to us, but he wasn't the guy. Suddenly, we're back to square zero. We didn't have any more witnesses. No more people were coming forward. This case is dead.
There was no relief for a long time period. And you'd have nightmares. I had nightmares of different people, different faces.
You get up screaming and fighting. You fall out of bed, slinging your arms. And
the doctors call them night terrors, but I don't think you've had one this week, but last week. Generally, they used to be, when this was going on, they were every night.
I was just trying to take it all in. I was newly married. I was pregnant with my twins. I went into premature labor, and they died.
There's always going to be that little hole left in there. It never goes away. I wish it would.
There was a lot of fingers pointed at me, but what are you going to do? It was really hard to clear your name. Makes you very angry. It turns you into a mean person instead of a loving, caring person. I'd just go out and get drunk, end up in a fight. Cops came and got me. And I told them, don't you think you should be out finding my grandparents' killers? They weren't doing justice by my eyes. The rage in me wanted to come out because I wanted to know who did it, so we could go take care of it and get it over with.
What do you mean, take care of it?
Take care of it. That's how we was raised. An eye for an eye. Tying them to a pickup and drag them up and down the logging road and stop and throw rock salt on them and watch them sit there in pain and drag them a little more and let them bleed to death. I dreamt of ways to torture them. And I don't know that we'll ever find peace until we find out who did it.
When I was hired at the Lewis County Sheriff's Office, this case was already cold for 20 years. I'm in my mid-20s. I said, I want to solve the murder of Ed and Minnie Marin. I went into the sergeant, and the sergeant goes, what are your goals for this year? And I said, well, I want to solve this case. The detective said this case has been unsolved for years and years. You might want to think about some other things, like property crimes, burglaries, and I said, no, I'm serious. So when I opened up the case, the first thing is going through this massive amount of case file. I'm reading this case every single night, and I'm so fascinated because this is, I feel, one of the most horrific crimes in Lewis County history. We got a robbery, we got a kidnapping, and we have a double murder. I'm living this, breathing this. I want the who, the what, the how, the where, the why. But I'm not the first detective to investigate this case. And so for me, I had to think about something that I can do different.
Hello, hi, is Frank there? Yeah. Frank, this is Bruce Kimsey.
I ended up going through every single statement of a witness saying, I saw the vehicle. I mean, just near Yardbirds alone, you had over a dozen people who saw that vehicle.
Did you see the Morin vehicle?
I'm sure it was a darker green Chrysler or something like that.
This is a small-town community. People knew who Ed and Minnie were, and so their vehicle was a very well-known car. I created a map, and I would pinpoint witnesses on the map. This is Highway 12. We start from the Marin residence, and several hundred yards from the Marin residence is the first witness.
He was going east.
Are you on the same side of the road or the opposite side?
Opposite side.
I could see the path of Ed and Minnie's vehicle from their residence all the way to the woods outside of Chehalis, where they were killed. The descriptions match Ed driving the car, Minnie in the front passenger seat. They could only see one person in the back seat. Can you describe what he was wearing?
Kind of a green army type coat.
Remember the face at all?
I really didn't pay that much attention.
This is December 1985 in Lewis County. This suspect is in the vehicle driving all over the town. This is broad daylight. In a small town like this, somebody must have seen something.
While Detective Bruce Kimsey was fishing for more evidence, I was kept in the dark. I was still considered a suspect because they felt that it had to be somebody that was close to the family.
Some of the theories in the beginning involve the family, because Ed and Minnie are the type of people that do not share their financial statements or financial information to anyone other than family. They're kidnapped out of their house. They're taken to the bank. Ed requested $8,500. I think someone that would be more familiar with them probably would have gotten more money than what they did. Ed and Minnie are from the Depression, and they had multiple bank accounts, which is a very common thing for people that age. They would separate their money. And in this case, they went to one bank when they could have gotten a lot more money. Maybe it's not someone that's close to them. Maybe it's not a family member. It's someone that may not know them that well. Ed and Minnie had a farm with Christmas trees, which would bring in labor workers to work in these trees.
You know, part of the reason that they wanted to look at the people that worked at the Christmas tree farm is A, it was right next to the house, and you would have contact with Ed and Minnie, and B, those Christmas tree farmers tend to be somewhat more transient in nature.
Back in 1985, the police officers at the time took photographs of anybody working in the area. Every witness was shown photo montages of these people. The photo montages are about the size of a baseball card, and a person would have to look at this and identify who they saw.
The copies that we had were just not good. They were like copies of a copy of a copy. You couldn't tell who it was.
I went back and found the original photographs, which were in color, and I scanned them, and I'm using software cleaning up the original to make 8x10 pictures. They look better. You can see more of a description on a person's face, make out their eye color, their hair color, instead of a black and white.
You know, that's an area where technology really helped because it was like we had a whole new investigative tool.
Do you remember back in '86 giving 2 statements to detectives?
Yes, I do.
I needed to find every witness in this entire investigation and then talk to them one more time. I showed you 6 separate photographs, and you immediately picked out one.
That was the guy that was in front of Ed Minns.
Did you get a good look at his face?
I got a good look at his face.
You know, it was amazing that as we sat and talked with the witnesses, they knew that they had seen someone, but it wasn't until that they saw the clearer photographs that they were able to pick out who it was in the backseat.
It's all starting to add up, but I still need more information. I think there's a witness out there that knows what happened.
I'm going down to Oregon to go deer hunting. I'm driving around in my pickup, and I have this guy holler at me, "Hey, Hadler." I was like, God, who knows me in this town now? And so I turn around and look, and it's an old buddy from high school, Jake Shriver. So I walk across the street, and we start BSing.
I saw Mike periodically. You know, and I would ask him, hey, what's going on with their grandparents' case, you know? After the murders, I always have to pass the Marin's house. My heart would just sink, and I just put my head down in shame. I said to Mike, I'm sorry, please forgive me.
He said, I can't do this anymore. I said, you can't do what? He goes, I gotta tell you something. And he said, you don't understand the hell that I've lived with this on my mind for the last 20-some years.
I just had to tell the truth. I feel responsible for causing them so much pain for so long. I still feel horrible. Back then, I mean, I was scared. And I was a 17-year-old kid. I never told anyone, but I know what happened. My mother was driving Highway 12 west. A car pulled out in front of us. It was an older car, and they were going slowly. So I said to my mother, I said, pass them. So we passed them, and it was the Marins. It was foggy out, but I could see who was in the back seat. They were heading westbound on Highway 12. Mr. Marin was driving, and in the passenger front seat was Mrs. Marin. In the back seat, there was 2 people. I knew him when I was young because they worked for the Marines on the Christmas tree farm. It was Rick Reif and Greg Reif. And I told him a few days later, Greg Reif walks over. He said, "Did you tell anybody?" And I said, "No." I said, "I did not say anything to anybody." I said, "I swear to God." And I had not said anything. And he said, "Well, if you say anything, the same thing that happened to them will happen to you. We'll kill your mother, we'll kill your brothers, we'll kill your father, and then we'll kill you." The Reif brothers started driving by our house almost daily. They kill these sweet, innocent, elderly people. They're not going to stop after that. They're going to kill my whole damn family. I mean, I started carrying a gun since I was 17 years old because of the Reif brothers. If I had left the house and I didn't have a gun, I was 5 miles away, I'd turn around and go back and get one. But I am always packing, still to this day. You know.
You wearing a gun now?
I don't have a gun now, but I have one in the drawer behind me. So. I knew they did it.
It's all starting to add up, and then Jake Shriver comes to the office and he gives a statement. Jake Shriver's statement is huge because in addition to seeing Rick and Greg Reif in the Marin vehicle, Jake ended up being threatened by the suspects. And what they said was, "We'll kill you, we kill your mother," just like Ed and Minnie Marin. And that is like one of the first admission statements that I ever heard them say. Just blew that case wide open. This is my theory of what happened. Rick Reif and his brother, Greg, they were known drug addicts and criminals in the area. The Reifs knew who Ed and Minnie were because of Dennis Hadler and Hadler Logging. And so they knew there'd be money. That night, the Reif brothers knocked on the door. When they get into the house, they discovered bank statements, but there's no money. In the morning, they're kidnapped out of their house. They're taken to the bank. They get the money, and they take them up this logging road. They were killed inside their own vehicle. Minnie was shot in her back, and the pellets went through her body and came out portion of her upper shoulder and face. Ed was shot dead center in the back. Bodies were dragged out into the woods and dumped. Then they turn around and come back to Yardbridge parking lot. Short time later, they leave and they move up to Alaska.
In my eyes, there's only one place them two brothers deserve to be, and they both need to be in the ground. These son of bitches are still sitting there living, and they took something out of my life that I'll never get back, that none of my family will ever get back. I found out through the investigation that the Reif brothers were up in Alaska. And so I went to Alaska. Some things just need to be done. And I ain't never gonna be at rest or at peace until they're all dead. I had found out the area the Reif brothers were in. I was going to take care of the situation. I was going to take them, kill them, feed them to the crabs, leave it at that, and walk away.
After all these witnesses identifying either Rick or Greg Reif, I finally had enough information to go to the prosecutor and request a warrant to arrest them for the murders of Ed and Minnie.
The thought never leaves your mind about who killed your grandparents. I would spend my nights going through bars, trying to find out where they lived. Most people either hadn't heard of them or didn't want to admit that they heard of them. And by right so, they needed to be scared of them because they wouldn't give a shit about pulling the trigger on me or you or anybody.
We have the warrants, we're good to go. So we start booking the flights to go up to Alaska. And this is when I discovered that John Gregory Rife had died.
When that news came out, it was kind of a blow.
I was just thinking, what are the chances? Could we get a little bit of luck here? You know, we spent all these years working up to this, and the day we get the warrant, he's dead. But I knew that Rick Rife was still alive, so we knew we had to get on this now. And so we fly up to King Salmon, Alaska, where Rick Rife was living.
I got a phone call from my dad, and he says, I know what you're doing up there, and this ain't the way to handle it, and you need to get your ass back down here and be with your family. You know damn good and well that Grandma and Grandpa wouldn't want you handling it this way.
When Mike was in Alaska, I think Mike would have done him in. That would be an awful burden to have all the rest of Mike's life.
I really don't know what made me turn the cheek and go the other way. Greg had died, and that really pissed me off, that he didn't have to come down and face the music. But somebody was trying to send me a message to get out of there, and that's what I did.
We're walking down a gravel driveway of Rick Rife. It was pretty surreal. This is 10 years of my life hunting down the killer, not knowing how this is gonna go. I'm scared that he's gonna grab a gun, something bad's gonna happen. I walk up to the door, I see beer cans and a hatchet. The Alaska State investigator knocks 2 or 3 times, and the door creaks open. I'm thinking, oh boy, this is not gonna go good. And you can hear a male's voice say, "Who the is it?" He stands up, and he looks a lot different from what I expected. He has tubes going into his nose. He's on an oxygen machine. We tell him we have a warrant for 2 counts of murder, robbery, kidnapping. And he is so matter of fact. At this point, the state investigator advises him he's under arrest. And the only thing he says, well, looks like I'm gonna need my medications. I said, do you ever think all these years that detectives would knock on your door? And he said, well, yeah. When that sentencing and verdict came down on Rick Rife, I've never sensed any feeling like that in my career. I was just really proud of our community, proud of our system.
Kimsey and the Lewis County detectives finally delivered justice as Rick Rife is in prison for the murder of Ed and Minnie. Their greatest hope, though, is that it may finally bring the Marine family some peace.
Hello, young lady.
Hey there.
Hello, Denise.
Oh.
How you been?
I'm better now. I told you on the phone I'd be better when you got here. Oh my gosh. Grandma and Grandpa are alive in my heart and in my fondest memories. But without them here, the family hasn't been together again. So it was time to get together and maybe have a Hadler cousin reunion.
Is that Michael? Oh, God. I haven't seen him for a long time.
I haven't either.
Oh, hi, kid. I guess what people don't really realize is my grandparents were only the first victim. Then you got the family. You know me, let's have a drink.
Let's go. If I could go back and speak to my grandmother, I would tell her I have 5 grandkids and I'm living the life I've always dreamed of. I think she'd be proud of me.
The human mind is a landscape of profound complexity, capable of the highest forms of devotion and the most unfathomable depths of destruction. When we look into the annals of violent crime, we are naturally drawn to seek out grand, sweeping motives. We look for the classic triggers that have driven human narratives for centuries. We expect to find elaborate conspiracies, millions of dollars embezzled and hidden away in secret accounts, deep-seated romantic betrayals, or intricate webs of lies that finally collapse under their own weight. We want the reasons for murder to be as monumental as the act of murder itself. It gives us a sense of comfort to believe that it takes a colossal force to push a human being to take the life of another. However, the most chilling narratives are often those that strip away these grand illusions, leaving us face to face with the terrifying reality of the mundane. Sometimes, the catalyst for absolute devastation is not a grand betrayal or $1 million life insurance policy, but the quiet, slow, and invisible accumulation of daily irritations. Imagine, if you will, the setting of American Samoa in the year 1986. Geographically, it is a place that evokes images of absolute tranquility. It is a scattering of lush, volcanic islands resting isolated in the vast, seemingly endless expanse of the South Pacific Ocean. For many who only see it in photographs or read about it in travel brochures, it is the definition of a tropical paradise. The air is heavy with humidity and the scent of salt. The pace of life is dictated by the rhythm of the ocean, and the geographical isolation offers a profound disconnect from the chaotic rush of the modern mainland world. It is a place where one might go to find peace, to reconnect with nature, or, in the case of our story, to dedicate one's life entirely to a higher spiritual calling. Into this setting, we must place a very specific type of environment, a missionary home. This is not merely a residence. It is a specialized communal living arrangement designed for individuals who have chosen to step away from secular pursuits to focus entirely on their faith. In this particular case, the home belonged to members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, a denomination known for its rigorous dedication to evangelism, its strict adherence to biblical teachings, and its strong emphasis on community and moral purity. The individuals who live in such a home are not there by accident. They are there by choice, bound by a shared belief system and a unified purpose. They are colleagues in faith, partners in a divine mission, expected to embody the very virtues of patience, love, understanding, and forgiveness that they preach to the outside world. A missionary home is supposed to be a sanctuary. It is designed to be a safe harbor where believers can retreat after long days of ministry, a place to find spiritual and emotional support among like-minded peers. But the reality of communal living, no matter how deeply rooted in shared faith, is entirely bound by the frailties of human nature. When you place a group of adults into a closed, shared environment, you are fundamentally altering the boundaries of personal space and individual autonomy. The missionary home in American Samoa was exactly this kind of closed system. The geographical isolation of the island itself was mirrored by the insular nature of the home. The residents worked together, prayed together, and lived together under one roof, sharing not just their spiritual lives, but the intensely mundane realities of daily existence. It is within these mundane realities that the seeds of an unimaginable tragedy were sown. We must look past the theological discussions and the hours spent preaching and look instead at the kitchen sink, the living room floor, and the shared cooking spaces. The facts of this case draw a stark, uncompromising line away from the dramatic and point directly toward the incredibly petty. The individuals at the center of this narrative are a married couple, Kath and Ed Sedlick, and their fellow missionary colleague, Michael Adams. All three were deeply embedded in the life of the church. All three shared the same overarching spiritual goals, and all three shared the exact same living space. Yet, beneath the surface of this shared devotion, a silent, toxic undercurrent was beginning to pull them apart. The friction did not begin with a theological schism or a fundamental crisis of faith. It began with the chores. In any shared living situation, the division of labor is a delicate balancing act. Who cooks the meals? Who washes the dishes? Who sweeps the floors? Who ensures that the communal spaces remain clean and respectable? In a normal environment, a disagreement over dirty dishes might result in a brief argument, a slamming of a door, or perhaps a temporary silent treatment. People can leave the house, go for a long drive, vent to outside friends, and return with a cooler head. But the missionary home in American Samoa functioned remarkably like a psychological pressure cooker. A pressure cooker works by trapping steam in a sealed environment, allowing pressure and temperature to rise far beyond normal limits to break down tough elements. When the human mind is placed in a similarly sealed environment, the results can be catastrophic. For Michael Adams, the missionary home became a vessel with no release valve. The minor, everyday conflicts regarding household duties did not dissipate. They were trapped. A missed turn at cooking, a perceived lack of effort in cleaning, or a disagreement over how a chore should be performed did not fade away. Instead, these grievances compounded. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the irritation built upon itself. It is a terrifying aspect of human psychology that the absence of a major conflict can sometimes make minor conflicts consume our entire field of vision. Without a profound crisis to lend perspective, the placement of an unwashed pan or the failure to take out the trash can morph into an agonizing personal insult. For Adams, the Sedlicks ceased to be his brothers and sisters in faith. In the dark, twisting corridors of his isolated mind, Kath and Ed Sedlick transformed from colleagues into relentless sources of torment. The facts indicate that this was not a sudden snapping, but a slow, agonizing descent into an obsessive, localized hatred. The arguments were small, petty, and persistent, forming a relentless static that drowned out reason, faith, and basic human empathy. We must consider the agonizing irony of this situation. Here were individuals who spent their days speaking to others about the promise of a peaceful paradise, about divine love, and the importance of turning the other cheek. Yet, within the walls of their own sanctuary, a lethal hostility was taking root. Adams was experiencing a profound cognitive dissonance. The external expectation of peaceful, brotherly love was violently colliding with his internal, boiling resentment over the most trivial aspects of domestic life. He felt wronged, he felt burdened, and most dangerously, he felt entirely trapped by his circumstances. The closed environment of the missionary home meant there was no avoiding the Sedlicks. Every meal, every evening, every morning was a reminder of his perceived grievances. The island offered no escape, and the house offered no refuge. The concept of the pressure cooker syndrome is vital to understanding the anatomy of this specific tragedy. It explains how the human capacity for tolerance can be gradually eroded until nothing remains but raw, unfiltered rage. Adams did not wake up one day and arbitrarily decide to commit an atrocity. He was slowly dismantled by his inability to process and communicate his frustrations effectively. The lack of a healthy outlet, combined with the forced proximity of his perceived enemies, created a fatal psychological loop. Every minor disagreement over a chore was interpreted as a deliberate act of disrespect. Every unwashed dish became a monument to his building fury. As the calendar turned to the year 1986, the atmosphere inside the missionary home must have been suffocating. The tension would have been a tangible weight in the air, A heavy silence that settled over the dining table, a rigid stiffness in the hallways. The Sedlicks, dedicated to their work and their marriage, were likely entirely unaware of the lethal magnitude of Adams's resentment. They may have viewed him as a difficult roommate, a stubborn colleague, or simply someone who was struggling to adapt to the rigors of communal missionary life. It is highly improbable that they recognized they were living with a man who was actively transitioning from an annoyed housemate into a calculating killer. They could not have known that the mundane arguments over cooking and cleaning were not just passing storms, but the very foundation of their impending doom. They could not have anticipated that the sacred space they shared, a home dedicated to the promotion of eternal life, was about to become the site of a brutal, cold-blooded execution. The human brain naturally resists the idea that someone we live with, someone we pray with, could harbor such ultimate malice over something so profoundly trivial. And so, we arrive at the precipice of January the 9th, 1986. The tropical night in American Samoa would have fallen heavy and dark over the island. The missionary home, usually a place of quiet reflection and rest after a day of religious service, was settling into silence. The residents were retiring to their private quarters, expecting nothing more than the routine passing of another night. The Sedlicks retreated to their bedroom, seeking the vulnerability of sleep, completely blind to the fact that the pressure cooker had finally reached its absolute structural limit. The valve was about to blow, and the catalyst was not a crisis of faith, but the unbearable, toxic weight of unwashed dishes and unswept floors. The true horror of this story lies exactly here, in the realization that the line between a sanctuary and a slaughterhouse can be drawn entirely by the dangerous, silent accumulation of the ordinary. To truly understand the gravity of what transpired in that house, we must first look at the lives that were extinguished and the environment that inadvertently nurtured such a quiet, deadly hostility. Kath and Ed Sedlick were not merely victims of a random act of violence. They were individuals who had dedicated their entire existence to a singular, consuming purpose. They were husband and wife, but their bond extended far beyond the traditional confines of a marriage. They were united by a shared, unwavering faith as members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they had chosen a path that demanded absolute commitment. To be a missionary is to accept a life of profound sacrifice. It requires a person to willingly strip away the comforts of secular ambition, the familiarity of their homeland, and the standard benchmarks of material success. The Sedlicks made a conscious decision to travel to the remote, isolated territory of American Samoa, believing wholeheartedly that their physical presence and active preaching were essential to a higher divine plan. They were there to serve, to educate, and to live as exemplary models of their faith. This level of dedication implies a certain type of psychological resilience and an idealistic worldview. The Sedlicks would have arrived on the island with a strong sense of purpose, expecting to face challenges related to cultural adjustments and the arduous work of proselytizing. They were mentally prepared for doors to be closed in their faces by strangers, for long days walking in the oppressive tropical heat, and for the inherent difficulties of translating their complex theological beliefs to a new community. What they were entirely unprepared for was the threat that was slowly gestating inside their own sanctuary. They viewed their fellow missionaries not just as colleagues, but as an extended spiritual family. In their eyes, Michael Adams was a brother in faith, a man who had made the exact same sacrifices they had. The foundational trust required to live and work in such a demanding environment meant that the Sedlicks likely operated with an inherent assumption of goodwill toward their housemate. This fundamental belief in the shared goodness of their mission blinded them to the darkening reality of their immediate domestic situation. The dynamic between a married couple and a single individual in a closed, communal living space introduces a highly complex layer of psychological friction. Kath and Ed Sedlick were a unified front. Through the simple virtue of their marriage, they possessed a built-in support system that Adams fundamentally lacked. They shared a private world, an exclusive intimacy, and a continuous, unspoken dialogue that naturally isolated anyone living on the periphery of their relationship. When a disagreement arose over the division of household labor, it was never truly an argument between three equal individuals. Even if they did not intend it to be so, it was inevitably the couple versus the solitary man. If Kath believed the kitchen was not cleaned properly, Ed would naturally support his wife. If Ed felt the division of cooking duties was unfair, Kath would naturally validate his frustration. For Michael Adams, navigating these daily domestic negotiations must have felt incredibly unbalancing. Every minor grievance was implicitly backed by a 2-to-1 majority. This numerical and emotional disadvantage can easily breed a deep sense of alienation and resentment in the mind of the isolated individual, transforming a simple request to sweep the floor into an perceived orchestrated attack. Furthermore, we must deeply examine the specific geographical and physical context of this tragedy. American Samoa is a territory characterized by its breathtaking natural beauty, but it is also defined by its extreme, inescapable isolation. It is an island environment situated in the vast expanse of the South Pacific, far removed from the massive continents and the sprawling infrastructure of modern, secular society. For a missionary, this isolation is theoretically ideal, meant to remove worldly distractions and allow for total concentration on spiritual duties. However, from a psychological standpoint, an island is a closed system. The boundaries of your world are rigidly defined by the ocean. When interpersonal conflicts arise, the natural human instinct for flight is severely restricted. You cannot simply pack your bags and drive across state lines to clear your head. The oppressive humidity and the relentless tropical heat can exacerbate feelings of claustrophobia and irritability. The environment itself becomes a physical manifestation of the psychological trap closing in around the residents of the home. Within this isolated territory stood the missionary home, a structure designed to be a bastion of faith and harmony. The architecture of communal living is inherently demanding. It forces individuals to share the most intimate and mundane spaces of daily life. The kitchen, the bathrooms, the living room, and the dining areas are all common ground. The only true sanctuary, the only space where an individual can completely drop their guard and escape the scrutiny of others, is their private bedroom. For Kath and Ed Sedlick, their bedroom was their shared refuge, a place to decompress from the rigors of their ministry and the subtle tensions of the house. For Michael Adams, his room was a solitary confinement where his brooding thoughts had no counterbalance. The shared spaces of the house, which should have been areas of fellowship and mutual support, gradually transformed into contested territories. The kitchen sink, the stovetop, and the living room floor became silent battlefields where the war of attrition was fought daily. In a secular household, tensions over chores are typically resolved through blunt communication, arguments, or the eventual dissolution of the living arrangement. Roommates might yell, throw a dish, and ultimately move out. But a religious missionary home operates under a completely different set of behavioral expectations. The residents are bound by a strict moral code that mandates patience, forgiveness, and the outward display of brotherly love. Openly expressing visceral anger or engaging in prolonged, screaming arguments is viewed not just as a breach of domestic etiquette, but as a severe moral failure. Therefore, the anger does not disappear. It merely sublimates. The requirement to maintain a facade of Christian grace forces individuals to swallow their irritations. This forced suppression is perhaps the most dangerous element of all. When people are not allowed to be angry, their anger ferments. It turns into passive-aggressive behavior, silent judgments, and deep, internalized bitterness. Every time Adams felt slighted by the Sedlicks over a domestic chore, he could not simply yell at them. He had to absorb the perceived insult, smile, and continue his holy work, pushing the fury deeper into his subconscious. The trivial nature of the conflicts cannot be overstated, yet it is precisely this triviality that makes the situation so utterly terrifying. The data points strictly to arguments over cooking, cleaning, and the general maintenance of the shared environment. We must consider the psychological weight of these mundane tasks. Preparing food is a deeply personal and nurturing act. When tensions surround the cooking schedule, the very act of eating together, a ritual that is supposed to symbolize unity and communion, becomes fraught with anxiety and resentment. If the Sedlicks cooked, Adams might have felt patronized or dissatisfied. If Adams cooked, He might have felt unappreciated or judged by the couple. The act of cleaning is intimately tied to respect for the shared space and, by extension, respect for the people inhabiting it. A failure to clean the kitchen to the Sedlick standards might have been interpreted by them as a lack of dedication or discipline on Adams's part. Conversely, their demands for cleanliness might have been perceived by Adams as draconian control and persistent nagging. Over the course of several months, this cycle of suppressed irritation and perceived slights created a toxic atmosphere that poisoned the very air inside the missionary home. The Sedlicks, steadfast in their routine and secure in their marriage, likely viewed these issues as annoying hurdles to be managed through prayer and patience. They continued their preaching, they maintained their relationship, and they likely believed that the domestic friction was just a temporary trial that would eventually be overcome by faith. They could not perceive that their housemate was operating on a completely different psychological frequency. For Adams, the religious mission had become entirely secondary to the intense, localized warfare occurring in the kitchen and the hallways. The Sedlicks were no longer his spiritual siblings, they were the architects of his daily misery. The physical walls of the missionary home, combined with the geographical boundaries of American Samoa and the rigid behavioral constraints of their religion, formed a perfect, inescapable pressure cooker. The heat of their daily interactions was slowly rising, the steam of unexpressed anger was expanding, and the structural integrity of Adams's mind was quietly fracturing under the strain, setting the stage for a catastrophic and violent release that no one in that household could have ever predicted. The transition from the sweltering heat of the tropical day into the heavy, suffocating darkness of the night on January the 9th, 1986, marked the final, irreversible turning point in the psychological unraveling of Michael Adams. In the territory of American Samoa, the night does not bring a crisp, refreshing coolness. Instead, it blankets the islands in a dense, inescapable humidity that seems to amplify the silence and isolate every individual within their own physical space. Inside the missionary home, the daily routines had finally come to an end. The communal spaces, those silent battlegrounds where the war of attrition over chores and cleanliness had been waged for months, were now entirely empty and quiet. The kitchen sink was clear, the floors were still, and the shared living areas were shrouded in shadows. For the other residents of the house, this darkness represented a period of necessary rest, a temporary reprieve from the exhausting physical and mental demands of their religious calling. They retreated to their private quarters, seeking the profound vulnerability of sleep, trusting implicitly in the safety of their sanctuary and the inherent goodness of the people they lived alongside. But for Michael Adams, the quiet of the night offered no such peace. In the absolute stillness of his room, the static of his suppressed rage was no longer competing with the ambient noise of daily life. It was the only sound left in his mind, a deafening, localized storm of resentment that had finally completely eroded his moral and rational foundations. In the solitude of his private space, Adams made a decision that severed his final ties to his faith, his humanity, and his sanity. The accumulation of trivial grievances, the unwashed dishes, the perceived slights regarding cooking duties, and the agonizingly petty disputes over household chores coalesced into a single, terrifying imperative. He did not seek out a Bible for comfort, nor did he fall to his knees in prayer to beg for deliverance from the darkness consuming him. Instead, his hands sought out the cold, uncompromising weight of a firearm. The presence of such a weapon within the walls of a home entirely dedicated to the teachings of peace and eternal salvation is a chilling paradox that underscores the absolute deterioration of the environment. As Adams prepared the weapon, checking its mechanism and ensuring it was fully ready to discharge its lethal purpose, he was engaging in a methodical, deliberate process that stood in horrific contrast to the impulsive, hot-blooded nature of many crimes of passion. This was not a sudden explosion of anger occurring in the middle of a heated screaming match in the kitchen. This was a calculated, solitary preparation for an execution. Every movement he made in the dark, every metallic click of the gun, was a physical manifestation of a man consciously crossing the ultimate threshold from which there could be absolutely no return. When Adams finally opened the door of his room and stepped out into the hallway, he was no longer functioning as a missionary, a colleague, or a brother in faith. He had transformed himself into an apex predator within a confined environment, navigating the very corridors that had served as the arteries of his daily torment. The house was profoundly silent, the kind of deep, unbroken quiet that only exists in the dead of night when the occupants are completely surrendered to sleep. As he walked toward the private bedroom of Kath and Ed Sedlick, he passed by the communal areas that had fueled his hatred. He moved past the kitchen where the arguments had festered, past the dining area where the silent judgments had been passed. Yet, in this fatal moment, those spaces no longer mattered. His entire existence had narrowed down to a singular, violent objective. The physical distance between his room and the Sedlick's bedroom was likely only a matter of a few yards, a short walk down a familiar hallway, but psychologically, he was traversing a massive, unbridgeable chasm. With every deliberate step he took on the floorboards, he was systematically dismantling the sanctity of the missionary home, turning a place of spiritual refuge into a terrifying trap. The door to the Sedlick's bedroom stood as the final physical barrier between the sleeping couple and the impending devastation. Behind that door, Kath and Ed were existing in a state of absolute defenselessness. Sleep is the ultimate expression of trust. It requires a subconscious belief that the environment is secure and that those nearby mean no harm. The Sedlicks had retired for the night with the expectation of waking up the next morning to continue their ministry, entirely unaware that the culmination of their roommate's obsessive hatred was standing just inches away. They were completely blind to the fact that their lives were about to be extinguished not by a stranger, not by a robbery gone wrong, but by a man they prayed with, ate with, and lived with every single day. Adams did not pause to reconsider. He did not knock on the door to initiate a final confrontation. He did not seek to wake them up so he could articulate his grievances and witness their fear or remorse. His intention was not to communicate or to punish through terror. His sole, unwavering intention was to annihilate the source of his frustration with maximum efficiency and absolute finality. Adams opened the door to their bedroom and stepped into the darkness. The atmosphere inside the room would have been heavy with the slow, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping couple. In a matter of seconds, that peaceful rhythm was violently and permanently shattered. Without a single word of warning, without any hesitation or preamble that might have afforded the victims even a fraction of a second to comprehend their reality or attempt to defend themselves, Adams raised the firearm and unleashed a barrage of bullets directly into the bed. The sensory impact of the gunfire within the enclosed space of the bedroom would have been apocalyptic. The deafening, concussive roar of the weapon discharging again and again obliterated the silence of the tropical night. Bright, violent flashes of light illuminated the room with every pull of the trigger, capturing brief, horrific snapshots of the destruction he was raining down upon the defenseless couple. Kath and Ed Sedlick were brutally murdered in the very place they should have been most secure, violently thrust from the tranquility of sleep into the finality of death, without ever having the opportunity to understand why they were dying or who was killing them. The absolute cowardice and brutal efficiency of the attack ensured that they had no chance to fight back, no chance to flee, and no chance to plead for their lives. The catastrophic noise of the gunshots acted as a violent shockwave that violently ripped through the entire missionary home. For the other residents who were sleeping in their respective rooms, the sudden explosion of sound was an incomprehensible violation of their reality. They were jolted awake in a state of sheer terror and absolute confusion. In the immediate, disorienting aftermath of the gunfire, the human brain struggles desperately to process such extreme sensory input, often attempting to rationalize it as thunder, a bursting tire, or something falling. But as the sharp, acrid smell of burnt gunpowder began to seep under their doors and permeate the humid air of the hallway, the horrifying reality of the situation began to set in. Driven by a primal mixture of fear and the urgent need to understand what had just happened to their home, the surviving missionaries cautiously opened their bedroom doors and stepped out into the corridor. Their eyes, still adjusting to the darkness, frantically searched for the source of the devastation. What they witnessed in those agonizing moments following the massacre would be burned into their memories forever, a visual representation of absolute, chilling apathy that was far more terrifying than the noise of the gunshots themselves. As the witnesses peered out from their rooms, they did not see a man fleeing in panic, nor did they hear the sounds of someone weeping in sudden, overwhelming remorse. Instead, they saw Michael Adams emerging from the direction of the Sedlicks' bedroom. He was not rushing. He was walking down the hallway and descending the stairs with a slow, deliberate, and entirely unhurried gait. In his hand, he still firmly gripped the weapon, the metal now visibly stained with the blood of his colleagues. His posture was not that of a man who had just committed an unthinkable crime in a fit of temporary madness and was now breaking down under the weight of his actions. His demeanor was described as completely cold, detached, and chillingly calm. He moved with the lumbering, silent purpose of someone who had just completed a necessary task. The utter lack of emotion on his face, the steady grip on the bloody firearm, and the slow, heavy footsteps on the stairs painted a portrait of a man who had entirely disconnected from his humanity. For the terrified witnesses frozen in the hallway, the sight of Adams walking away from the slaughter with such profound indifference was the ultimate confirmation that the man they thought they knew, the brother in faith they had lived alongside, had been completely consumed by a monstrous, unforgiving darkness. He simply walked away, leaving behind a shattered sanctuary, 2 brutally murdered colleagues, and a legacy of horror born from the quietest, most mundane corners of human existence. The immediate aftermath of the massacre within the missionary home was defined by a jarring transition from the absolute silence of a sleeping household to the frantic, chaotic sensory overload of a crime scene in progress. As Michael Adams descended the stairs, his movements methodical and terrifyingly detached, the remaining residents were thrust into a state of paralyzed shock. The air in the hallway was thick with a suffocating, acrid scent of gunpowder, a visceral reminder of the violence that had just unfolded only a few doors away. For the survivors, the initial moments were not characterized by immediate heroics or clear-headed confrontation, but by the overwhelming, primal struggle to process an impossible reality. They had just been startled from their sleep by the thunderous, unnatural roar of gunfire, and their minds were desperately grasping for any explanation other than the one staring them in the face. Yet, as they emerged from their rooms and encountered Adams, the reality of the situation became impossible to deny. He was a presence of cold, heavy stillness, walking through the center of their sanctuary with a weapon still dripping with the blood of their colleagues, and in that moment, the entire structure of their communal life collapsed into a heap of confusion, terror, and grief. The investigation into the actions of Michael Adams began with the arrival of the American Samoa Police, who were summoned to the scene with the speed necessitated by the sheer gravity of the reports. The law enforcement officers were met with a scene that was as profoundly disturbing as it was straightforward in its basic facts. There was no complex mystery to untangle regarding who had committed the murders. The evidence was immediate and overwhelming. Adams was still present at the location, his posture and demeanor offering no resistance that suggested any struggle or attempt at escape. The police officers, tasked with securing the area, were confronted by the chilling sight of a man who had effectively ceased to operate within the bounds of human empathy. He did not attempt to flee into the night, nor did he exhibit the frenzied, desperate behavior typical of someone who had recently committed a crime of passion. Instead, he allowed himself to be apprehended with a terrifying, hollow passivity, as if his purpose had been served and the world around him had ceased to hold any further meaning or consequence. The act of his arrest was not a dramatic struggle between law and outlaw, but the quiet, grim closure of a chapter that had been building toward this conclusion for months. As the authorities secured the scene and began the painstaking work of forensic documentation, the layers of this tragedy began to be peeled back. The investigators, who were accustomed to handling the dynamics of a small island territory where communities were close-knit and secrets were hard to keep, were faced with the task of understanding the internal logic of a crime that originated within the most private of spaces. They interviewed the witnesses, the other missionaries who had been jolted from their sleep that night, and the picture that began to emerge was one of slow, corrosive erosion rather than sudden, inexplicable insanity. The accounts gathered by the police detailed a pattern of behavior that was both profoundly unsettling and, in a twisted way, entirely consistent with the psychological pressure cooker that the missionary home had become. The detectives learned of the long-standing, seemingly petty grievances that had plagued the household. They heard testimonies about the persistent, low-level friction regarding the division of chores, the endless negotiations over the kitchen and the common areas, and the way that the shared life of these three individuals had been poisoned by the weight of unspoken resentments and the rigid, suffocating expectations of their communal environment. The forensic evidence, when combined with these witness statements, painted a clear, uncompromising narrative of the events that led to the execution of Kath and Ed Sedlick. The investigators processed the bedroom where the murders took place, mapping out the precise angle of the shots and the absolute lack of any signs of a struggle. It was evident that the victims had been taken completely by surprise, their final moments spent in the vulnerability of sleep, ensuring that there was no opportunity for them to confront their attacker or attempt to protect each other. The weapon recovered from Adams, once subjected to ballistics and forensic analysis, served as the final piece of a puzzle that the police were rapidly assembling. It was not a weapon that had been brought into the house as part of a premeditated plan from the very beginning. Rather, it was a tool that Adams had acquired and kept, likely as his internal rage grew and his mental state deteriorated into the dark, obsessive need for a final, violent resolution to his perceived suffering. The investigators meticulously cross-referenced the timelines provided by the witnesses with the forensic findings, creating a comprehensive report that left no room for ambiguity regarding the culpability of the suspect. The process of the investigation was also deeply influenced by the specific cultural and social context of American Samoa. The authorities had to navigate the delicate, high-stakes atmosphere of a close-knit religious community where the reputations of all involved were paramount. The investigators conducted their inquiries with a level of rigor that sought to respect the gravity of the situation while ensuring that no detail, however small, was overlooked. They delved into the history of the interactions between Adams and the Sedlicks, questioning the other residents about the evolution of the conflict. The reports that emerged from these interrogations were consistent in their depiction of Adams as a man who had become increasingly isolated within his own mind, unable to communicate his frustrations effectively, and eventually viewing the couple as an insurmountable obstacle to his peace. The investigators, who were tasked with translating these raw, painful details into the formal language of a criminal case, were forced to confront the chilling reality that the most horrific acts are often fueled by the most mundane, everyday irritants that simply never found a path to resolution. As the investigation moved into its final stages, the focus shifted from the what and the how to the why. This was the most difficult aspect of the police work, as it required them to step inside the psyche of a man who had fundamentally rejected the possibility of interpersonal resolution. The investigators examined the way that the missionary lifestyle, with its emphasis on constant proximity and the performance of spiritual virtue, might have exacerbated the underlying issues. They looked for any external signs of mental instability, any history of violence, or any prior warnings that might have suggested that Adams was capable of such an extreme outcome. Yet, the evidence pointed not to a history of clinical insanity or a prior criminal record, but to a slow, calculated process of psychological fragmentation. The investigators identified the key moments where the potential for intervention might have existed, the missed opportunities for the missionaries to openly address their domestic tensions, and saw how each missed opportunity served only to increase the pressure within the house. The documentation of the crime became a testament to the dangers of forced, silent proximity and the way that minor, petty conflicts can be amplified into absolute, fatal catastrophes when they are allowed to fester in the dark, restricted spaces of human isolation. By the time the investigation concluded, the police had not only built an airtight case against Michael Adams, but they had also laid bare the anatomy of a tragedy that stood as a stark warning about the fragile nature of human patience and the lethal potential of the everyday. The meticulous work of the law enforcement team ensured that the facts were preserved with absolute clarity, leaving no room for the mitigation of the crime, and setting the stage for the judicial process to address the horrific loss of life that had occurred within that quiet, shadowed house in American Samoa. Throughout this period, the burden on the survivors was immense, as they had to relive the trauma of that night through countless interviews and statements, forced to articulate the slow, steady decay of their communal peace to a world that was struggling to grasp the simplicity and the brutality of what had been lost. Their testimonies became the backbone of the prosecution's case, providing a human voice to the clinical evidence and ensuring that the memory of the Sedlics was not lost in the cold, detached process of the legal system. As the investigators finalized their reports, the weight of the tragedy seemed to settle over the entire island, a permanent reminder of the moment when the ordinary became the monstrous. The legal proceedings that followed the massacre of Kath and Ed Sedlick were a stark, somber reflection of the gravity of the crimes and the profound trauma left in their wake. As the case moved toward trial in the summer of 1986, the atmosphere within the judicial system in American Samoa was one of heavy, deliberate solemnity. The community, still reeling from the shock of such an act occurring within a circle of individuals dedicated to peace and faith, looked toward the court to provide a measure of justice that could balance the scales of such an incomprehensible loss. The prosecution, armed with the meticulous forensic evidence and the haunting, first-hand accounts of the surviving missionaries, was prepared to present a case that would underscore the cold-blooded nature of the double homicide. The threat of the ultimate penalty loomed over the proceedings, casting a long, intimidating shadow over Michael Adams and his legal team, who were tasked with the impossible job of navigating the reality of a murder that had been committed in such a public, yet entirely domestic, vacuum. In the months leading up to the final verdict, the legal strategies were defined by a tense, high-stakes negotiation process. The prosecution was tasked with demonstrating that the murders were not the result of a sudden, uncontrollable outburst of insanity, but were instead the culmination of a deliberate, calculating, and ultimately lethal descent into obsession. They needed to strip away any potential for the jury to view the event as an accidental tragedy and instead highlight the methodical preparation that Adams had undertaken, the acquisition of the weapon, the movement through the hallway, and the choice to enter the couple's private sanctuary to execute them in their sleep. This was the narrative that the prosecution crafted, one of premeditation, of a man who had chosen to resolve his domestic grievances with the ultimate finality of violence. The defense, meanwhile, faced the daunting reality of their client's actions. With the evidence so overwhelmingly stacked against Adams, and with the witnesses ready to recount the terrifying sight of him walking calmly away from the scene of the crime, the defense had very little room to maneuver. As the legal timeline progressed, the reality of the potential sentencing began to exert a powerful influence on the trajectory of the case. The prospect of the death penalty was a real and terrifying weight that hung over the deliberations, and for a man like Adams, who had spent his life operating within the structure of a rigid, moralizing belief system, the thought of facing the ultimate punishment likely triggered a desperate, tactical reevaluation of his position. It was within this context of looming finality that the decision to pursue a plea bargain was finalized. This was a critical pivot in the case, a moment where the complexity of a jury trial was set aside in favor of a calculated resolution. By entering a plea, Adams effectively acknowledged his role in the deaths of the Sedlicks, shielding himself from the absolute, irrevocable consequence of the death penalty. It was a choice born from the instinct for self-preservation, a desperate attempt to secure a future that, while confined to the walls of a prison, would still allow for the continuation of his biological life. The hearing in August of 1986, which served as the conclusion to the criminal proceedings, was a brief yet devastating event. The courtroom was filled with the weight of the tragedy, the silence of the attendees punctuated only by the formal, rhythmic progression of the legal process. For the survivors, the friends and families of the victims, and the broader community that had been touched by the horror of the event, this was a moment of profound, painful closure. When Adams formally entered his plea, the air in the room seemed to shift, a collective, heavy exhaling of breath as the finality of his guilt was placed on the record. He did not provide a grand, dramatic explanation for his actions, nor did he offer an apology that could have ever begun to address the magnitude of the pain he had inflicted. The legal system, in its cold and dispassionate language, processed the admission of guilt for 2 counts of second-degree murder, a designation that acknowledged the taking of life while reflecting the specific legal arguments that had led to the agreement between the prosecution and the defense. The sentencing phase of the trial was a reflection of the compromise that had been struck. By accepting the 2 counts of second-degree murder, the court was officially acknowledging the gravity of the crime while also formalizing the legal conclusion of the case. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke to the wreckage that had been left behind, to the lives that had been extinguished in their prime, and to the complete collapse of the trust that was supposed to define the environment of the missionary home. For Adams, the sentencing marked the final, irrevocable departure from the world he had once known. He was to be removed from the society he had failed to navigate and relocated to a state of permanent confinement. The legal process, which had begun with the arrival of the police on that dark January night, reached its logical, if deeply dissatisfying, conclusion. There was no victory here, no sense of triumph for the law enforcement or the prosecution. There was only the cold, hard, and final reality of justice being served in the wake of an unthinkable, unnecessary, and utterly tragic loss. Throughout these proceedings, the legal team's adherence to the facts provided in the official records ensured that the narrative of the crime remained anchored in reality, avoiding any attempts to mythologize or sensationalize the horror. The focus remained squarely on the victims, Kath and Ed Sedlick, whose lives were the true center of this narrative. Their absence from the courtroom was the most powerful evidence of all, a silent, persistent void that the legal arguments and the formal sentencing could never truly fill. The courtroom, with its sterile environment and strict adherence to protocol, provided a sharp contrast to the intimate, chaotic, and deeply personal nature of the violence that had taken place. It was a place of formal resolution, a space where the state exercised its authority to assign culpability and determine the future of a man who had forfeited his humanity. As the proceedings drew to a close and the gavel fell, the legal chapter of this story was sealed, but the reverberations of that night remained, a testament to the fact that when the ordinary becomes the monstrous, the process of justice is often just the final, necessary step in acknowledging the depth of the tragedy. For all those involved, the end of the legal process was not the beginning of healing, but the starting point of a long, arduous journey to make sense of a reality that, even in the harsh light of the law, remained as incomprehensible as it was devastating. The verdict had been delivered, the sentence had been handed down, and the name of Michael Adams was now forever tied to the chilling, mundane, and brutal execution of his 2 colleagues, leaving the rest of the world to look back and wonder how a life of service could have ended in such a catastrophic failure of the human spirit. The legacy of the massacre at the missionary home in American Samoa is not found in the grand halls of justice or the formal records of criminal history, but in the enduring, haunting reflection on how easily the foundations of human connection can crumble under the weight of the mundane. When we contemplate the tragedy of Michael Adams and the senseless annihilation of Kath and Ed Sedlick, we are forced to confront a terrifying, uncomfortable truth. The most profound dangers to our existence often do not come from the external shadows of society, but from the quiet, internal decay of our own daily lives. The story of what happened on January 9, 1986, serves as a grim monument to the psychological fragility inherent in closed environments, where the forced proximity of individuals, no matter how unified by shared faith or purpose, can act as a catalyst for a type of destruction that is as slow and methodical as it is inevitable. The aftermath of the trial and the sentencing of Adams did not bring with it a neat resolution or a sense of closure. Instead, it left behind a persistent, gnawing question about the nature of tolerance, communication, and the hidden pressures that govern the human experience. The tragedy of the Sedlick's death is amplified by the sheer triviality of the motives that led to their execution. In a world that often seeks to find meaning in the motivations for violence, the reality that a double homicide could be fueled by disputes over cooking, cleaning, and the maintenance of a shared home is profoundly jarring. It forces us to reconsider the importance we place on the small, daily irritations that we all encounter. We often believe that our morality, our religious convictions, or our dedication to a higher calling serves as a sufficient shield against the darker impulses of the human heart. Yet, the case of Michael Adams demonstrates that these external structures, no matter how robust or deeply held, can be rendered entirely ineffective when the internal mechanism of the mind is being hollowed out by the slow, compounding weight of suppressed resentment. The missionary home, intended to be a sanctuary of divine grace and brotherly love, became a crucible of human failure, proving that even the most sacred of spaces is not immune to the corrosive power of the ordinary. The concept of the pressure cooker syndrome, which so accurately describes the trajectory of Adams's mental decline, serves as a vital lesson for any communal living situation. It highlights the absolute, non-negotiable necessity for healthy, open, and honest channels of communication. In a society that often encourages the suppression of frustration in favor of maintaining social harmony, the case of 1986 stands as a warning against the dangers of silence. The Sedlicks were murdered because the conflicts within that house were never allowed to breathe. They were trapped, forced to exist in an environment where the expression of anger was discouraged, leading to a dangerous sublimation of those emotions into a dark, obsessive hatred. This, perhaps, is the most crucial takeaway from the entire narrative: the importance of acknowledging and addressing the small, nagging frictions of life before they have the chance to transform into something monstrous. When we refuse to speak of the small things, we create the perfect, quiet space for the big things to take root and destroy us. Furthermore, we must reflect on the profound, irreversible loss of the Sedlicks, two lives that were defined by their commitment to a mission they believed to be greater than themselves. Their story, which ended in such a brutal, cold-blooded manner, is a reminder of the vulnerability of those who operate in good faith. They entered that home in American Samoa with the intention of spreading hope and peace, never imagining that the person they lived with could harbor such lethal malice. Their memory deserves more than just a place in a criminal file. It deserves to be a catalyst for a deeper, more empathetic understanding of the human condition. The violence they endured was a negation of everything they lived for, and the only way to honor their lives is to continue the conversation about the dangers they were blindsided by, ensuring that their sacrifice is not forgotten in the clinical, dispassionate analysis of the crime. The tragedy was not just the act of killing, but the absolute failure of the environment around them to perceive the darkening state of the man who stood among them. The judicial resolution of the case, while necessary for the functioning of the law, did little to address the wider, existential questions posed by the incident. The sentencing of Adams to 2 counts of second-degree murder was a statement of legal accountability, but it could never provide an answer to the why that continues to haunt the families of the victims and the remaining members of that missionary group. It is a stark reminder that the law is often an inadequate tool for processing the true, visceral horror of human betrayal. The formal, sterile language of the courtroom is a poor substitute for the empathy and understanding that might have prevented the tragedy in the first place. As time moves forward, the case of Michael Adams remains a lingering, cautionary tale, one that is stripped of any romantic or dramatic embellishment and left with its raw, uncomfortable core, a story about how the failure to navigate the simplest, most mundane aspects of shared existence can lead to the ultimate, irrevocable devastation of life. Ultimately, the story of this 1986 tragedy is one that we are all implicated in, to some degree. We all live in systems, whether they are households, workplaces, or communities, and we all experience the friction that comes with sharing space and responsibility with others. We all have the capacity for frustration, and we all have the choice of how to process that frustration. The case of Michael Adams is an extreme, terrifying manifestation of the wrong choice. It is a story that demands we look closely at our own lives, at the people we live and work with, and at the way we handle the quiet, daily, and often deeply irritating realities of being human. It challenges us to be more open, to be more patient, and to recognize that the most significant threats to our peace are often the ones we are too busy to notice, too proud to speak about, or too afraid to address until it is far too late. The shadow cast by the missionary home in American Samoa is a long one, and it serves as a permanent, silent reminder that the peace we build in our homes is fragile and that it must be nurtured, protected, and fought for with an honesty that does not shy away from the truth, no matter how small or seemingly petty it may appear to be. The legacy of the tragedy is not just a warning of what can happen, but an invitation to live with greater awareness, greater connection, and a deeper, more intentional commitment to the humanity of those who share our lives, ensuring that we never again allow the silence of the ordinary to transform into the roar of the monstrous. Through the passing decades, the details of the crime have become historical, but the lesson remains profoundly contemporary, urging us all to listen to the whispers of dissatisfaction before they become the screams of violence, and to value the presence of our companions, for the sanctuary we call home is only as strong as the empathy we bring to it every single day. As the dust settles on the historical account of the 1986 tragedy in American Samoa, we are left with the daunting task of contextualizing such a singular event within the broader scope of human experience. While the legal files have long been closed, and the name of Michael Adams has largely faded from the public consciousness, the psychological and societal echoes of that night in the missionary home remain resonant. This final reflection requires us to move beyond the specific facts of the case, the weapons, the timing, and the courtroom outcomes, and to grapple with the disturbing implications of how such a narrative can occur within a framework of dedicated faith and communal living. It is a story that defies the typical expectations of true crime, which usually leans toward the sensational or the depraved, and instead forces us to look into the mirror of the mundane, recognizing that the potential for violence exists not just in the chaotic streets of the world, but in the quiet, sterile, and overly ordered spaces we construct for ourselves. The missionary home was, by its very design, a space where the normal stressors of human interaction were intended to be superseded by a higher set of values. The inhabitants were meant to be governed by a code that prioritized patience, altruism, and the communal good. Yet, this very expectation of perfection created an environment where the expression of normal, healthy human emotions such as irritation, disagreement, or resentment was pathologized as a failure of faith. When individuals are pressured to perform constant, unwavering harmony, the natural, inevitable friction of domestic life does not cease to exist. It merely goes underground. This is the central, terrifying paradox of the missionary home. The more they were expected to be unified, the more isolating their small, daily disagreements became. For Michael Adams, the inability to express his frustration openly meant that every unwashed plate and every disorganized chore became a personal, deliberate slight. He was living in an environment where his internal reality was increasingly disconnected from his external performance, and the longer this dissonance persisted, the more volatile his mental state became. When we consider the transition from an annoyed roommate to a cold-blooded killer, we must analyze the role of the pressure cooker effect in a vacuum of emotional support. Adams did not lack intelligence or the capacity for reason. He lacked a constructive mechanism to release the mounting psychological steam. In a more secular environment, a person might have found an outlet, a friend outside the house, a hobby, or simply the ability to walk away from the situation. But the insular, isolated nature of the missionary home in American Samoa, combined with the geographical remoteness of the territory, acted as a physical and mental prison. There was no outside relief valve. Every morning brought the same people, the same duties, and the same unresolved conflicts. The environment, which should have been a source of support, became the primary architect of his mental breakdown. The tragedy is therefore not merely an individual failure. It is an indictment of a living structure that provided no space for the messy, contradictory, and deeply imperfect nature of human beings. The victims, Kath and Ed Sedlick, represent the ultimate, tragic loss in this narrative. They were people who believed in the inherent goodness of their mission and the integrity of their community. Their deaths, occurring in the most private and vulnerable moments of their lives, are a haunting reminder that trust, while essential for communal living, can be turned into a weapon by the very person one is living with. The fact that they were killed in their sleep, without a word or a chance to comprehend their fate, adds a layer of profound, senseless cruelty to the story. They were not combatants. They were not targets of a grand conspiracy. They were simply two individuals who became the fixation of a man who had lost his way in the dark corridors of his own mind. To honor them, we must resist the urge to view them as mere statistics or as archetypes of martyrdom. They were human beings with lives, hopes, and futures that were stolen by a man who had replaced his capacity for empathy with an obsession for control and a desire for final, violent release. Reflecting on the role of the broader society, we must also acknowledge the failure of the systems meant to ensure safety and well-being. Was there no indication that Adams was fracturing? Could the other members of the missionary group, in their own adherence to the standards of faith, have missed the signs of his descent? These are questions that continue to linger, even decades later. It is a harsh truth that in many closed communities, the pressure to maintain the appearance of stability often overrides the need to confront the reality of individual struggle. When everyone is trying to be the perfect missionary, the person who is failing in silence can easily hide in plain sight. The case of 1986 is a warning that we must be vigilant not just for the overt threats to our security, but for the subtle, quiet shifts in the people around us. Empathy, while often spoken of as a virtue, is a practical, life-saving tool that requires us to pay attention, to listen to what is not being said, and to recognize when the people we live with are reaching their breaking point. The legal resolution, while necessary, was deeply unsatisfying. The plea bargain, which saw Adams sentenced for second-degree murder rather than facing the potential for the death penalty, is a reflection of the pragmatic nature of the law. It settled the account on paper, but it could never address the existential questions that the tragedy raised. It left behind a sense of unfinished business, a desire to understand the why that the legal process was not designed to answer. What happens to a man who commits such an act? How does he reconcile his past with the reality of his future in confinement? These are questions that exist outside the jurisdiction of the court. The legacy of the case is a persistent, nagging reminder that the law is only one part of the response to violence. The true work of justice, the work of understanding, preventing, and healing, happens in the spaces that the law cannot reach. It happens in our conversations, in our relationships, and in our willingness to be open about the challenges of living together. As we bring this account to a close, we must return to the initial premise, the danger of the ordinary. The story of Michael Adams and the Sedlicks is one that should unsettle us, not because it is exotic or strange, but because it is so fundamentally human. It is a story about the fragility of our peace, the importance of our patience, and the catastrophic potential of our silence. We are all living in homes, communities, and systems that are prone to the same pressures that define the missionary home in American Samoa. The lesson of that 1986 night is that the sanctuary we build for ourselves is not a static object. It is an active, ongoing effort of empathy and communication. If we allow the small things to fester, if we value the appearance of harmony over the reality of our conflicts, we are creating the very conditions that lead to our own undoing. May we remember the Sedlicks not just for the way they died, but for the life of service they sought to live, and may we carry the lesson of their loss with us as a reminder to be more intentional, more compassionate, and more deeply connected to the people who share our lives. The darkness of that tropical night may have passed, but the light of understanding, if we are brave enough to seek it, is the only way to ensure that such a tragedy remains a part of the past, rather than a precursor to our future. The quiet, hidden places of the human heart are where the most important work of our lives is done, and it is there that we must strive for the light of honesty, the warmth of understanding, and the enduring strength of a truly shared, empathetic existence. The final assessment of this tragedy demands that we cast a wider net over the remnants of the lives affected and the long-term echoes of this chilling episode in the history of American Samoa. To conclude this journey, we must grapple with the concept of memory and the way in which society chooses to internalize or discard such narratives. The massacre in the missionary home in 1986 did not merely end 2 lives. It fundamentally altered the landscape of the community that remained. Those who survived, the fellow missionaries who were startled into a new, horrific reality on that January night, were forced to navigate a life thereafter defined by the before and the after. They carried with them not only the trauma of witnessing the immediate aftermath of a brutal murder, but also the weight of the questions that had no easy answers. Could they have done more? Should they have noticed the fractures in Adams's persona sooner? These questions, however unanswerable, are the silent companions of those who survive such domestic catastrophes. They represent the burden of the witness, a lifelong contemplation on the thin line that separates peaceful coexistence from sudden, total collapse. The silence that followed the legal resolution of the case did not equate to peace. For the families of Kath and Ed Sedlick, the resolution provided by the judicial system was likely a cold comfort, a procedural closure that did not replace the presence of their loved ones. The loss of a child, a partner, or a sibling to such a senseless act of violence creates a vacuum that is impossible to fill. Their mourning was likely compounded by the public nature of the tragedy, as their private grief became a subject of historical record, analyzed by investigators and observers who could never truly comprehend the depth of their bereavement. This is the hidden cost of public tragedy. It strips the victims of their privacy and forces their families to live in the shadow of a story that is told and retold by strangers. The sanctity of the Sedlicks' lives, their motivations, and their faith were all momentarily subsumed by the notoriety of their deaths, and it is a task for history to restore their humanity by focusing on their lives rather than just the final, violent moments of their existence. As we step back from the specific details, we must also consider the evolution of the missionary organization itself. The realization that a tragedy of this magnitude could occur within its ranks must have necessitated a profound internal reckoning. Institutions, like individuals, are prone to the same pressures of silence and the same desires to maintain a facade of perfection. The case of Michael Adams likely forced a reassessment of how these groups support their members, how they handle interpersonal conflicts, and how they define the boundaries of their communal living arrangements. It is a necessary, albeit painful, evolution for any organization to move from an emphasis on strict adherence to behavioral norms to a greater focus on the mental and emotional well-being of its people. The lesson learned by the survivors and the institution at large is that faith is not a substitute for the fundamental psychological necessities of communication, empathy, and the honest acknowledgement of human limitations. The passage of 4 decades has transformed this event from a current news story into a historical marker, a point of reference that tells us much about the social and psychological climate of the mid-'80s. It remains a stark reminder that the geography of a location, whether it be the isolated islands of American Samoa or the dense urban environments of the mainland, cannot insulate us from the inherent volatility of human nature. The environment may change, the cultural context may vary, but the fundamental struggle to live in peace with those around us remains a constant, universal challenge. The story of Adams and the Sedlicks is a case study in the anatomy of a breakdown, showing us that when we ignore the small signs of human distress, we are essentially walking toward a precipice. This lesson is as relevant today as it was in 1986, and it serves as a persistent call for us to look after one another with a level of attention and care that goes beyond the superficial. Looking forward, the preservation of this story serves a purpose that is both somber and essential. It is not meant to fuel a morbid fascination with the acts of a killer, but to provide a grounded, objective look at the consequences of unaddressed human conflict. By documenting the details with such care, we ensure that the reality of the tragedy is not lost to the fog of rumor or the distortions of sensationalism. We maintain the dignity of the victims and the gravity of the legal process, while simultaneously offering a lens through which we can examine our own relationships and the health of our own communities. The legacy of the missionary home is that it forces us to ask ourselves, how do I handle my own frustrations? How do I listen to the people I share my space with? Am I creating an environment of open support, or am I fostering a pressure cooker that could, in the right circumstances, lead to an unthinkable outcome? The resolution of the legal case was merely the closing of a file, but the resolution of the human tragedy is an ongoing, infinite process. We find it in the way we communicate, in the way we extend grace to those who are struggling, and in the way we build systems that prioritize the individual's mental and emotional health alongside their duty to a collective mission. The Sedlicks, had they lived, would have continued their work, likely striving for the same goals of peace and spiritual connection. The fact that their lives were truncated by the very colleague they were meant to support is a heavy, sobering reality that we must continue to reflect upon. Their story, in its final form, is a testament to the fact that we are all responsible for the atmosphere in which we live. Every conversation, every gesture of patience, and every act of honest communication is a brick in the wall of our communal sanctuary. In this concluding analysis, we are left with the awareness that the story of the missionary home is a microcosm of the human experience. We are all, in various ways, missionaries of our own causes, living alongside others, navigating the mundane, and dealing with the weight of our own expectations. The risk of the pressure cooker is always present, and it is our collective duty to ensure that we provide the safety valves of empathy and open dialogue. If we can do this, we honor the memory of the Sedlicks far more effectively than any memorial or monument ever could. We honor them by learning, by evolving, and by choosing to treat the people around us with a level of intentionality that prevents the darkness of the ordinary from ever again consuming the lives of those we hold dear. This has been the story of a tragic failure of human connection, but it is also an invitation to build something stronger, something more compassionate, and something fundamentally more human. As the narrative of the 1986 missionary massacre fades into the deeper archives of history, it remains a vital point of study, a warning, and a reflection. It reminds us that no amount of idealism, no level of religious or social devotion, and no degree of physical isolation can protect us if we neglect the fundamental, messy, and essential work of understanding each other. The house in American Samoa stands, perhaps, as a silent witness to what happens when we lose that understanding. But the world outside that house, the world we all live in today, is the space where we can ensure that such a story is never repeated. We carry the weight of these memories so that we might walk with a greater awareness, a deeper compassion, and a more profound commitment to the sanctity of every human life we encounter. The darkness of the past informs our present, and our present, through the wisdom of our reflections, shapes the future, ensuring that the light of our shared humanity remains the guiding force in all the homes, sanctuaries, and communities we inhabit across the world. The lesson is simple, yet it is perhaps the hardest one we will ever learn. Listen to each other, care for each other, and do not let the silence of the mundane become the harbinger of our end. The final horizon of this narrative does not lie in the past, but in the enduring ripple effects that such a tragedy creates within the architecture of our collective consciousness. As we reach the conclusion of this extensive examination into the 1986 massacre in American Samoa, we are tasked with synthesizing the disparate threads of the story, the mundane irritants, the suffocating atmosphere, the silent descent into madness, and the ultimate, irreversible fracture of life, into a cohesive understanding of why these tragedies persist in our world. We have traveled from the initial, innocuous disputes over household chores to the devastating finality of the courtroom sentencing, and in doing so, we have uncovered a reality that is far more unsettling than any fiction. The story of Michael Adams and the Sedlicks is a harrowing case study in the anatomy of human erosion, a reminder that the most significant threats to our stability are often those we ignore, downplay, or, worse, categorize as beneath our concern. When we consider the broader impact of this tragedy, we must acknowledge that its true power lies not in the shock value of the murders, but in the relatability of the origin. Everyone, at some point in their life, has found themselves in a situation of forced, uncomfortable proximity. Whether it is a shared living space, a long-term professional partnership, or a communal religious environment, we all know the subtle, grinding friction of differing personalities and habits. Most of us, through the grace of patience, the intervention of outside support, or the simple act of venting, manage to navigate these waters without descending into the abyss. But the case of 1986 serves as the extreme outlier that defines the limits of our tolerance. It forces us to ask, what happens when those safety valves are absent? What happens when the social structure, in this case, the rigid requirements of a missionary life, demands that we suppress our humanity in favor of an outward performance of virtue? The answer, as we have seen, is the creation of a pressure cooker. This term is not merely a metaphor, it is a psychological reality. By requiring individuals to inhabit a shared space while simultaneously prohibiting them from expressing their genuine, often messy, frustrations, the missionary home effectively turned its residents into participants in their own destruction. Michael Adams was not born a monster, and he did not become one overnight. He was, by all accounts, a man who had made significant sacrifices to be where he was. Yet, he was also a man who possessed a limited capacity to process the trivialities of domestic life. His inability to articulate his resentment, combined with the lack of an external outlet, meant that his hatred did not dissipate. Instead, it metabolized. It grew, it hardened, and it eventually became the only lens through which he could view his housemates. The tragedy is that this outcome was not inevitable. It was, in retrospect, entirely preventable through the simple, radical act of honest communication. As we look back at the lives of Kath and Ed Sedlick, we see more than just victims. We see individuals who are engaged in the most fundamental of human activities, building a life with a partner and dedicating their time to a pursuit they believed served others. Their absence is the most profound loss in this story, a void that the judicial process and the subsequent historical analysis can never fill. They were robbed of their future not by a grand, ideological struggle, but by the accumulation of mundane, everyday disagreements. This is the ultimate, bitter irony of their end. We expect our tragedies to be monumental, to occur on the stages of great history, yet the reality is that the most painful losses often occur behind closed doors, away from the gaze of the world, over things that seem small and unimportant until it is too late to change them. To remember them properly, we must hold on to the complexity of their lives and the depth of their commitment, ensuring that they are not reduced to the shorthand of a true crime statistic. The judicial proceedings that followed the massacre were an exercise in the pragmatic, dispassionate application of the law, a necessary ritual for a society attempting to regain its footing after such a violent disruption. However, we must remain aware that the law is not a panacea for the damage done to the soul of a community. The sentencing of Michael Adams was the conclusion of a legal process, but it was not the conclusion of the tragedy. For the families, the survivors, and the community in American Samoa, the process of reckoning with the event has been a long, slow journey that exists far outside the sterile boundaries of the courtroom. The impact of such an event is pervasive. It changes the way people interact, the way they build their homes, and the way they perceive the people they live and work with. It creates a lingering, subconscious sense of caution that can take generations to fully dissipate. Looking toward the future, the legacy of this 1986 tragedy should be one of heightened awareness. We must take the lesson of the missionary home and apply it to our own lives, however different our environments may be. We must foster environments where the expression of frustration is not viewed as a moral failure, but as a necessary and healthy component of communal life. We must build structures, both physical and emotional, that allow for the safe release of tension before it reaches the boiling point. We must be the kind of people who notice the subtle shifts in our neighbors, colleagues, and housemates, the withdrawal, the sudden, uncharacteristic sharpness, or the quiet, persistent anger, and have the courage to reach out before the damage becomes irreversible. Empathy is not a passive virtue. It is an active, demanding practice that requires us to be present, to be attentive, and to be brave enough to ask the difficult questions. The story of Michael Adams and the Sedlicks is a testament to the fact that we are all, to some extent, defined by the systems we choose to live in and the ways we relate to the people within them. The missionary home was a system that failed because it demanded too much and provided too little in terms of human support. Our own systems, be they modern households, corporate offices, or community groups, are equally susceptible to such failures if we do not prioritize the humanity of the individuals who inhabit them. We must be the guardians of our own peace and the architects of our own sanctuaries, ensuring that the spaces we build are characterized by an honesty that welcomes the entirety of the human experience, including the moments when we are tired, frustrated, and in need of grace. If we can achieve this, we will honor the memory of all who have been lost to the darkness of unaddressed conflict and we will build a future that is defined by the light of our shared and profoundly human understanding. As we conclude this 9-part exploration, it is fitting to reflect on the nature of the journey we have taken together. We have moved from the quiet, humid nights of American Samoa to the rigorous halls of justice, all the while keeping our focus on the reality of the people involved. We have sought to avoid the common pitfalls of the genre, the sensationalism, the fictionalization, and the moralizing, and instead remained grounded in the facts as they were documented. This commitment to the truth, however uncomfortable it may be, is the most respectful way to treat the memory of those who were lost. It is a reminder that stories like this are not merely entertainment. They are windows into the most challenging and essential aspects of the human condition. They demand that we sit with the discomfort, learn from the failure, and emerge with a renewed sense of purpose. The final image we are left with is not of the crime itself, but of the silence that followed, a silence that is both a heavy weight and an opportunity for reflection. We carry that silence with us, allowing it to inform our actions and our interactions, ensuring that the lessons learned from the missionary home in 1986 continue to serve as a beacon for our collective consciousness. May we continue to prioritize the simple, essential work of connection, knowing that the strength of our homes is built not by the perfection of our behavior, but by the depth of our compassion and the honesty of our shared life. The tragedy was a failure of the spirit, but our response to it can be a triumph of the heart. As we step away from this account, may we do so with a deeper commitment to the people we share our space with, always remembering that the sanctuary of our daily lives is a gift that must be cherished, protected, and shared with a level of intentionality that is worthy of the life we have been given. The chapter of Michael Adams is closed, but the work of building a more understanding, more empathetic world continues, one home, one conversation, and one life at a time. The finality of this account brings us to a place of profound introspection regarding the nature of human connection and the fragility of the peace we endeavor to maintain within our private sanctuaries. Throughout these reflections, we have dissected the 1986 massacre in American Samoa not merely as a historical event, but as a mirror held up to our own lives, our own frustrations, and our own capacities for both profound destruction and restorative empathy. The narrative of Michael Adams and the Sedlicks is a sobering reminder that the most significant events of our existence are rarely as grand or as dramatic as we imagine them to be. Instead, they are woven from the threads of our daily habits, the accumulation of our unspoken grievances, and the ways in which we navigate the quiet, narrow spaces of our domestic and professional lives. By revisiting these events with the gravity they deserve, we have explored the uncomfortable reality that when the systems we create for ourselves, be they religious, communal, or familial, demand a perfection we cannot sustain, we risk creating an environment where the internal pressure becomes lethal. The legacy of this tragedy is ultimately one of vigilance. We must remain ever conscious of the fact that we are all, to some degree, participants in the creation of the emotional climates in which we reside. The missionary home, with all its noble intentions and its strict adherence to a higher faith, failed because it did not account for the fallibility of the human heart. It assumed that shared belief would serve as a sufficient buffer against the friction of daily life, ignoring the basic human need for an outlet for frustration, for honest conflict resolution, and for the psychological space to be imperfect. This is a lesson that extends far beyond the walls of that house in American Samoa. It is a lesson for every living arrangement, every workplace, and every community. When we create environments that leave no room for the raw, authentic expression of the human experience, we are inadvertently fostering an environment where the ordinary can mutate into the monstrous. As we look toward the future, the memory of Kath and Ed Sedlick serves as an anchor. They were individuals who possessed a clear sense of purpose and a devotion to a mission that required them to step away from the comforts of the known and into the unfamiliar territory of a remote island mission. Their lives, while tragically cut short, remain a testament to the idea that there is value in service, in community, and in the pursuit of something larger than oneself. To honor their memory is to ensure that the circumstances of their deaths are never brushed aside or romanticized. It is to insist that we look at the reality of their loss with open eyes, acknowledging the preventable nature of the violence they endured. We must carry the weight of their story not as a burden of despair, but as a motivation to be more deeply attuned to the people who inhabit our own lives, ensuring that we never let the static of the mundane drown out the signal of someone else's suffering. Furthermore, we must address the role of empathy as a proactive, rather than reactive, tool. Empathy is often characterized as a soft, secondary trait, but in the context of the 1986 tragedy, it emerges as a critical, life-saving necessity. It is the capacity to look beyond the surface of a difficult colleague or an annoying housemate and to perceive the underlying struggle that they might be enduring in silence. It is the willingness to initiate the difficult conversations that could diffuse a mounting tension, and the courage to advocate for a culture where vulnerability is not seen as a weakness, but as a strength. If the missionary group had fostered such an environment, if they had permitted the open, messy, and necessary airing of grievances, the outcome could have been drastically different. The tragedy reminds us that our primary responsibility to one another is the cultivation of a space where the truth, however uncomfortable, can be spoken and heard, thereby preventing the buildup of the resentment that proved so fatal. The legal and historical record of the case stands as a permanent archive, yet it is a static one. The true resolution of such a tragedy occurs in the lived experiences of those who are touched by it and in the decisions we make in our daily lives as we move forward. We are the inheritors of these lessons, tasked with applying the wisdom gained from the failures of the past to the conduct of our own lives. We must choose, every day, to prioritize the health of our relationships over the convenience of our silence. We must choose to acknowledge the validity of our own frustrations and to find constructive, healthy avenues for their expression, rather than allowing them to fester in the dark corners of our minds. We must choose to be the kind of individuals who act as a stabilizing presence for others, creating a culture of support, understanding, and mutual respect that can withstand the inevitable frictions of human existence. As we bring this 10-part examination to a definitive close, it is essential to recognize that the story does not end with the final words on the page. It continues in the way we interact with the people around us tomorrow, in the way we address the small conflicts that inevitably arise in our own lives, and in the commitment we make to the humanity of our peers. The missionary home in American Samoa is a historical artifact, a place that has long since moved on, but the human tendencies that led to the events of January 9th, 1986, are ever present. We must remain aware of them, and through that awareness, ensure that we are not led down the same path of destruction. We are capable of much, both in terms of the beauty we can create and the harm we can inflict, and it is the responsibility of each one of us to ensure that the former always prevails over the latter. This exploration has been an exercise in the necessary labor of looking back so that we might walk forward with greater clarity. We have moved through the layers of the tragedy with a commitment to the truth, stripping away the noise to find the core of the experience. We have honored the victims, analyzed the perpetrator, and examined the environment, all in the service of understanding a tragedy that was as simple in its origin as it was horrific in its conclusion. May the memory of this event serve as a constant, quiet guide in our own lives, prompting us to be more patient, more observant, and more profoundly connected to the shared reality of our existence. We are all living in homes, we are all working in communities, and we are all navigating the complexities of human relationships, and in that shared space, we hold the power to create a future that is defined by the light of understanding rather than the shadow of the ordinary. Finally, we must recognize that the most powerful thing we can do in the face of such a tragedy is to live our own lives with a deep, intentional commitment to the values of empathy, honesty, and communal health. The story of 1986 is a warning, but it is also an invitation to value the life we have been given, to cherish the people who share it with us, and to recognize that the peace we build in our sanctuaries is a fragile and precious commodity that must be nurtured every single day. The darkness of that tropical night may have been deep, but the light of our shared commitment to one another is stronger, provided we are willing to do the work of connecting, listening, and caring. As we conclude this account, We do so with the hope that the story of the missionary home will serve as a permanent marker, a testament to the importance of the work we do together, and a reminder that we are all, in our own way, responsible for the world we inhabit. Through the lens of this tragedy, we see more clearly than ever that the path to a meaningful existence is paved with the efforts of our empathy, the clarity of our communication, and the enduring strength of our shared, human connection, ensuring that we live our lives with a sense of purpose that transcends the mundane and illuminates the profound beauty of our time on this earth. The conclusion of our comprehensive exploration brings us to the final, necessary stage of synthesis, where we must step away from the analytical gaze and hold the narrative of the 1986 missionary massacre in a place of quiet, reflective remembrance. To have traced the life of Michael Adams and the tragic end of Kath and Ed Sedlick is not merely an academic exercise in forensic investigation, but a profound engagement with the limits of the human capacity to tolerate the mundane. We have moved through the architecture of a pressure cooker environment, examined the slow decay of sanity within a house of faith, and witnessed the inevitable, catastrophic release of suppressed fury that forever altered the lives of everyone involved. As we stand at the end of this 11-part series, we must acknowledge that while the story itself has a formal beginning and end, the reverberations of what happened in that missionary home are continuous, serving as a permanent, silent guide for how we must navigate the complexities of our own shared existence. The core of this narrative rests on the tragic irony that a house dedicated to the promotion of eternal peace became the site of such a brutal, temporal violence. We must repeatedly ask ourselves how such a contradiction is possible, and the answer, as we have discovered, lies in the fundamental failure to treat the small, everyday irritations of life with the same level of seriousness that we reserve for our grander theological or ideological convictions. When we ignore the minor frictions of communal living, the unwashed dishes, the perceived lack of effort in chores, the subtle shifts in social dynamics, we are not practicing patience. We are practicing the art of avoidance. We allow the small to grow into the insurmountable and the mundane to become the monstrous. Michael Adams was not a stranger who broke into the home. He was a man who lived within the home, a man whose perception of reality was slowly, day by day, dismantled by the very people he should have been able to communicate with. The loss of Kath and Ed Sedlick remains the most significant and heartbreaking element of this entire account. Their lives were not just lost to a crime, they were lost to a failure of perception. The tragedy is that their deaths were preventable. Had there been an environment of genuine transparency, had there been the permission to speak of grievances without the fear of moral judgment, the path of Adams's mental deterioration might have been interrupted. To honor their memory is to commit ourselves to the creation of such environments in our own lives. We must be the kind of individuals who encourage honest dialogue, who recognize the signs of internal struggle in others, and who prioritize the health of our interpersonal connections over the performance of social or moral perfection. This is the only way to ensure that their sacrifice is not forgotten and that their story acts as a catalyst for a more deeply empathetic world. As we look toward the future, the lessons of 1986 must be integrated into the foundation of how we define community. We live in an era where the opportunities for isolation are greater than ever, even as we are increasingly connected by technology. The risk of the pressure cooker, the risk of internalizing our frustrations until they become toxic, is a constant challenge. We must be vigilant in cultivating spaces where the truth can be spoken. Whether it is in our homes, our workplaces, or our broader social circles, the practice of honest, respectful communication is the most effective defense we have against the darker impulses of the human heart. It requires courage, it requires vulnerability, and it requires the willingness to engage with the uncomfortable realities of living with other people. But as we have seen, the alternative is a price we cannot afford to pay. The judicial resolution of the case, while finalized in the summer of 1986, is only one part of the story. The true resolution is found in the continued commitment of those who remain to live with a greater understanding of the risks they face. It is a commitment that is tested every day, in every interaction, and in every challenge that arises in our shared spaces. The case of Michael Adams will always be a cautionary tale, a point of reference that reminds us of the fragility of our peace. It is a story that, when told with the necessary care and objectivity, functions as a mirror. We see our own frustrations, our own potentials for conflict, and our own capacities for resolution. It is through this engagement with the story that we find our way toward a more sustainable and compassionate future. In the final assessment, we are reminded that the most significant work of our lives happens in the quiet, often overlooked moments. The work of building a home, of maintaining a partnership, and of being a member of a community is not marked by grand gestures, but by the steady, intentional effort of being present and being honest. The tragedy of the missionary home is a reminder that we cannot rely on external structures alone to keep us safe or to maintain our peace. We must rely on each other. We must be the architects of our own emotional health and the guardians of the well-being of those we live with. This is a responsibility that we cannot outsource to any system, any religion, or any code of conduct. It is a fundamental part of the human experience that demands our constant attention and our unwavering commitment. As we bring this account to a close, we must hold on to the hope that we are capable of learning from our past. The story of what happened in American Samoa is a part of our collective history, a dark chapter that we have examined with the care and the respect that it demands. It is a story that has left its mark, and it is our task to ensure that the mark is one of wisdom. We must move forward with the knowledge that the ordinary is a powerful force, capable of both the great beauty of daily life and the great horror of its absence. We choose which direction that force takes by how we treat each other, by how we listen, and by how we communicate. The tragedy of the missionary home is a permanent reminder of the stakes involved, and it is a call to live our lives with a greater sense of purpose, a deeper empathy, and a more profound commitment to the humanity of every person we encounter. The silence that now surrounds the site of the 1986 massacre is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, historical silence that speaks to the fragility of our peace. We carry the weight of that silence into our own lives, allowing it to ground us, to remind us of the preciousness of our connections, and to prompt us to act with an intentionality that is worthy of the life we have been given. The tragedy was a failure of the human spirit in a place of supposed purity, but it has become a source of profound, enduring truth about the nature of our shared existence. We conclude this journey with a renewed sense of the importance of the work we do every day, the work of understanding, the work of forgiving, and the work of building a world where such a loss is impossible. Through the simple act of listening to one another, of valuing the truth, and of staying present in the messy, wonderful, and often difficult reality of being human, we find the strength to transcend the mundane, to rise above the darkness, and to live in a manner that truly reflects the best of our shared potential. This is the ultimate goal of our reflection, the final, lasting legacy of the story we have shared, and the path forward toward a future that is defined by the light of our collective understanding and the enduring, unbreakable strength of our humanity, lived out in all the homes, sanctuaries, and communities we inhabit across the world, one day at a time, until the end of our own journeys.